One of the key things we saw in that research was that for the people who managed after that year to still be on good terms with their friends with benefit, they had the communication in the beginning. They set the ground rules, got on the same page about what their expectations were. What is this and what isn't this?
You're listening to Sex with Emily. I'm Dr. Emily, and I'm here to help you prioritize your pleasure and liberate the conversation around sex. So are you suddenly feeling a little kinkier? Well, according to my guest, social psychologist and Kinsey Institute researcher Justin Lehmiller, a lot of us are ready to sex-periment right now. Justin shares fascinating sex research from the COVID era, the sex communication practices heterosexual individuals can learn from the LGBTQ plus community, and how to make casual sex better for women. Spoiler alert, emphasize her pleasure. We also unpack the Kinsey Scale and why sexuality is so freaking fluid, why threesomes are such a popular fantasy, and what our porn preferences reveal and don't reveal about us. Finally, we talk about sex education as it's practiced in the Netherlands and give you some incredibly useful tools for talking to your kids about sex, because it's really important. Please rate and review Sex with Emily wherever you listen to the show. Just do it right now. It takes you 2 seconds and it really helps get the show out to more people and more sex positive people like you who want to have better sex. You can also find me on all social media at Sex with Emily. If you're there, I'm there. My new articles, How to Master Fork Position and 5 Anal Adventures from Beginner to Advanced, are up on sexwithemily.com. Also, don't forget to sign up for my emails. You can find the link in the show notes. All right, everyone, enjoy this episode. I asked my Sex with Emily audience their most embarrassing penis questions, and one that kept coming up was, how can I increase my ejaculation? Helped by the ever-growing popularity of the money shot in pornography, semen volume seems to be a conversation growing in popularity. So can you really increase your load? Well, the answer is yes. You've got to get your hands on Popstar's volume and taste enhancers. These supplements help build up semen and increase ejaculatory volume. Not to mention, there's an added bonus of improved semen taste. We've all heard that age-old rumor to eat pineapple to taste better. Well, this supplement actually uses the bromelain from pineapple along with zinc and L-arginine to improve your overall taste in 2 to 3 weeks. This product was created by 2 of the country's leading men's sexual health physicians, so you're in good hands. Popstar is all-natural, high-quality, vegan, and non-GMO, made from the best ingredients and scientifically proven to work. Plus, you know I've got you guys with a discount code. You can save 20% with code Emily at popstarlabs.com/Emily. That's popstarlabs.com/Emily. popstarlabs.com/Emily. Use code Emily at checkout. We all know I'm a huge advocate for pleasure tools. You know, this can mean vibrators, lube, but did you know that you can use a pillow to improve your sex life? So an average pillow, we know, is meant to prioritize comfort during sleep. However, the Prim by Taboo is the perfect wedge pillow to really just elevate things in the bedroom. So the Prim is just this gorgeous pillow. It really does feel really good on your body. It's made of great materials, and it gives you a 7-inch lift in the bedroom to not only support your lower back and hips, but to give you the perfect angle to hit all the right spots for pleasure. Listen, we've all been there where you're in the moment and then maybe your partner slips out or you get a cramp and you have to take a breather. Or bottom line, the spot that feels the best can only be reached with a little elevation, and a pillow does that. So no more like futzing around, moving around. The Prim has got you covered. Designed with input from top urologists and pelvic floor PTs, this pillow is backed by science to improve your pleasure, as are all Taboo products. With a dual memory foam core and washable linen covers, it's available in 3 different colors. So listen, you're just a 20-degree angle away from bedroom bliss and more pleasure. Visit heytaboo.com/Emily and get your Prim today. That's heytabu.com/Emily and get your Prim pillow today. You're going to love it. I'm so excited for my guest. Dr. Justin Lehmiller is a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute. He runs a sex and psychology blog and podcast and is author of Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Dr. Lehmiller is an award-winning educator, prolific researcher, and leading voice in sexuality research and education. Learn more about Justin at lehmiller.com, Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller, and Twitter, Justin Lehmiller. That's Lehmiller. Hi, Justin. So good to have you back on the show, and you've been busy.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I mean, this pandemic has been an interesting time to be a sex researcher, and I've been busier than ever and conducting the most research and actually, I think, published the most of my entire career over this last year and a half.
Really?
In the beginning, my career totally changed because I had all of these speaking gigs lined up and I was going to be traveling the world. I think I was going to be in 7 different countries last summer. And so all of a sudden, I found myself with a lot of time on my hands. And I was talking to some of my colleagues at the Kinsey Institute, and we were seeing all these media headlines about, what was going to be happening to our sex lives, lots of big, bold predictions. And so we thought, is any of that actually going to shake out? So we wanted to actually collect the data to test whether what we were seeing in the media was actually coming to fruition. So, that kind of gave us the inspiration. And I think we all had more time on our hands and needed something to focus on. So we turned to sex research.
But I remember thinking, yes, Justin's doing this. What did we learn about this? Everyone's talking about the hot vax summer. What's up now?
So that's a great question. Last year there were lots of predictions about, when this pandemic happens and people are locked down, they're going to have more sex and masturbate more than ever because everyone's just going to be bored and horny. And it turned out last year that didn't really turn out to be the case. There's no baby boom. There's no evidence that, people were really having a lot of sex. So that's what we found last year in the research we did at the Kinsey Institute, although we did find that people were being more sexually experimental. About 1 in 5 people last year said they tried something new in the bedroom. So we recently conducted a new study to see, what do things look like this summer? Because everyone was talking about the hot back summer. So the Kinsey Institute partnered with Love Honey to do this survey of, what is happening right now in our sex lives and relationships. And one of the really interesting things we found was that there was an even greater trend toward sexual experimentation. So Americans have become kinkier. We actually found that a majority of Americans, 52%, said they tried something new in bed since the pandemic began. And also that a majority of Americans said that their sexual interests had shifted in some way. And of those who reported a shift, 3/4 of them said that they became kinkier. So, instead of the hot vax summer, we're kind of thinking of this as the hot kink summer, when people are kind of exploring their wild side.
That's exciting. What are they trying? What are they doing that's kinky?
Yeah, so kink is one of those big, messy terms that means different things to different people. The way we defined it for purposes of our survey was, interest in what you would consider to be non-mainstream sexual activities. So for some, that's BDSM type stuff. For others, it might be having a threesome or group sex. For others, it might be trying a sex toy for the first time, or, having sex in new positions and locations. There was all different kinds of stuff that people said they were trying. But interestingly, as someone who is a big sexual fantasy researcher, I saw that a lot of people said that one of the most common new things they did was to share and act on their sexual fantasies. So people got more in touch with their fantasies during this period. And also one of the really cool things about the recent study we did was that we saw that it was around 40% or so of Americans who said that they got better at communicating about sex. They felt more comfortable talking about sex with their partners. And so, for all this talk of doom and gloom, there are some positive sides of it, that we've become better sexual communicators in some way. We've started exploring other sides of our sexual selves that maybe we otherwise wouldn't have because we didn't really have the opportunity.
Yeah, I guess it was about having time.
Time was definitely a big part of it. Another part was that, people were really stressed and anxious. And so that actually creates, for a lot of people, this barrier to getting in the mood for sex and to feeling sexual desire. But if you engage in a new activity, you can kind of break through some of the inhibitions that are caused by stress and anxiety, because it creates this immersive experience that draws you in, that raises arousal, makes it easier to become aroused and stay aroused because you're in the moment when you're trying something that's new and different. So I think that was a big part of it for a lot of people. And then, also couples, I think, needed to find ways to kind of meet their needs for self-expansion, that need to keep trying new and different things. And since you couldn't leave your home and go out and do all the things you might normally do on, say, a date night, you kind of had to learn to try new things in the bedroom at home.
It's very, very hopeful. And it all comes through communication. We all need to, I always say communication is a lubrication. So people have the time and space to talk and to experiment. so many people email and call in with questions that their mind's wandering during sex and they're anxious and they're worried and they can't get in the mood and they're worrying about things. But when you try something new, a new act, a new sex act, even if it's talking dirty or a fantasy, your mind can't wander because you're both present and connected. Okay, Justin, let's talk about threesomes, because you did kind of mention that people were having threesomes during the pandemic and people were like, well, I thought we weren't supposed to be with anybody. But I had some people call into the show. I think there was a guy in Tennessee and he's like, we're having an eightsome over here. I'm like, 8 of you? You're having, okay. What about threesomes did you find during the pandemic, and how many people have had threesomes? I know you've done a lot of studies on threesomes.
Yeah. I'm a threesome researcher, and kind of what sparked my interest in it initially was I published this book a couple of years ago. We actually spoke about it on an earlier podcast of yours called Tell Me What You Want. I surveyed 4,000 Americans, 4,000 plus Americans about their sexual fantasies, and I found that threesomes were actually the most popular sexual fantasy. So that kind of got me interested in better understanding the psychology behind it. And ever since, I've included threesome questions on most of the sex surveys that I've done. So, to answer your question about how many people have ever had a threesome, if you look at nationally representative data, it's about 1 in 5 men and 1 in 10 women who say that they've ever had a threesome before. So when you look at the number of people who are fantasizing about threesomes versus the number who have actually done it, there's a pretty big gap between fantasy and reality. And when it comes to threesomes during the pandemic, that's kind of like the opposite of social distancing, right?
Exactly.
We were kind of told not to do group things, let alone just have sex with just one other person. So, but I think there were some people who were interested in having threesomes and who did have threesomes. I think it was around 2% of Americans in our recent nationally representative study that we did through the Kinsey Institute who said they had their first threesome during the pandemic. So some people did it. And some people also did virtual threesomes. That was another thing where they kind of had to find a new way to connect. It's like, I want to explore this side of myself, but some people didn't feel safe doing that in person. So they did it over Zoom.
We were doing everything over Zoom. Why not a threesome? We're having cocktails, going away parties, birthdays, why not? And I always tell people, practice a threesome at a time, dirty talk, text about it. What you found was that it's the number one fantasy for all genders, right? It's not, people always assume it's like men sometimes, but it's all genders fantasize about threesomes. But how does that differ what they are actually fantasizing about? Like, how do men and women differ in that way? Their attitudes towards it.
So on average, men fantasize about threesomes and group sex more often than women, but most women have had this type of fantasy before, according to the data that we've collected. And, in terms of overall differences in sexual fantasies, men and women have a lot in common. Most of the things that men are fantasizing about, women have fantasized about as well, and vice versa. But besides multi-partner sex, some of the other areas where we see differences are that women do tend to have more of the passion and romance fantasies. They fantasize about that more frequently than men do, but most men have those fantasies too. And interestingly, in the pandemic research we've conducted, we actually saw an increase in passion and romance fantasies. Like, that was the one type of fantasy where we really saw an increase over the last year and a half or so. And I think that it really speaks to the fact that so many people felt lonely and disconnected from people around them. And so they were trying to, turn inward and use their fantasies as sort of a way of coping. And so I think that kind of explains the rise of the passion and romance type fantasies.
That makes sense. How do you define a passion and romance fantasy?
Yeah, that's one of those things that can take different forms for different people. But the real core of the passion and romance fantasies is that it's about emotional connection. It's about being present and being connected to another person. And so that's what really distinguishes it from some of the other types of fantasies. That's not to say that you don't have passion and emotion in other types of fantasies. Like, certainly a threesome can be very passionate, right?
Yes.
And I think every type of fantasy we have, we're often trying to meet some type of deeper psychological need. And, for example, that can often be feeling desired. And so a threesome fantasy, I see that most people fantasize about being the center of attention in a threesome, which means, they want that attention and validation from other people. And so it's not necessarily just about, oh, I want extra bodies around and extra things to see and touch and feel and extra forms of physical sensation. No, it's often about like this deeper emotional need that people are trying to meet. So that's a different way of sort of looking at our sexual fantasies, is that they're not always about the sex act itself. Sometimes there's this emotional subtext that I think, as a psychologist, is really fascinating to explore.
I love to think about people fantasizing more about connection and intimacy. How do these threesomes turn out? Are people happy with the threesomes? Are they just a disappointment?
Great question. And so threesomes, despite being the most popular fantasy, they're also the fantasy that is least likely to turn out well. And I think that's because a lot of people don't really have a script for how it should go. So they get into the situation and they're not sure who's supposed to do what with whom and when, right? And oftentimes people have very discrepant ideas about how they want the threesome to go. And like I said, most people are fantasizing about being the center of attention, but not everyone can be the center of attention unless you're going to take turns and negotiate that and communicate and figure it out in advance. And this isn't to say that threesomes never work out well, because often they do. It's just that there seems to be a little bit more risk there because there often isn't the communication present between all partners. A lot of threesomes start with people just kind of having a couple drinks, and then next thing you know, clothes are coming off and they haven't negotiated or communicated about anything beforehand. So that's where I think a lot of them tend to go wrong. It's just there isn't that level of intimacy and communication with all partners. And I think that's actually where the virtual threesomes can be helpful as a practice, to kind of learn how to communicate with multiple partners at the same time and kind of figure out, how do we all get what we want out of this? And so maybe that's a good starting point for people. And maybe we'll be better prepared for threesomes because we practice them on Zoom.
Exactly. I mean, isn't that funny? Isn't that funny? Well, it is true. That makes so much sense. So the ones that are more successful are the people who did the planning. Sure, like a spontaneous threesome might work out well, but you're much more likely to work out if you've discussed it, you have boundaries, you have really healthy communication. Then you're probably going to do okay. But just, we got really drunk and the three of us fell into bed, maybe not as much.
Well, and there's also an interesting difference I see in my research based on people's sexual orientation. So, for example, heterosexual cisgender women tend to be the least satisfied with their threesome experiences, whereas gay men tend to be the most satisfied. And, everyone else is kind of somewhere in the middle. And I think part of it is that, when you're talking about a heterosexual dynamic, a heterosexual male-female couple, you have people often with different ideas of the gender of the third person they want to bring in, right?
Often.
And so somebody might be making a compromise or sacrifice in some way and doing something that, they'd like to have a threesome, but maybe it's not under their optimal circumstances. But if you're looking at, say, a threesome between three gay men, everybody's on the same page about the gender of the partner that they want. And so, there's some differences there, interestingly. And also just in general, sexual minorities, LGBTQ persons report better experiences acting out their sexual fantasies. And I think part of that is because they tend to have better sexual communication on average, and they're more likely to talk about what they want. And that makes it more likely that you're going to get what you want.
That's so interesting. So what do you think it is about the gay community that allows men to be better communicators?
Well, it's interesting. For example, if you look at an app like Grindr, right, which facilitates connections between men who have sex with men predominantly, and there's actually a lot of communication sexually that takes place on there. One of the most common phrases that you're going to see is, "What are you into?" Right? And so they have that discussion about, here are the sex acts that I am and am not into. And so you don't see that happening quite as often in heterosexual populations and on apps. There's just not as much negotiation beforehand about, here are the specific types of activities that I'm into and what my boundaries are. You'll see more discussion of kink on, apps like Grindr, just because there is that, sort of higher level of sexual communication. And I think in some ways a little bit less shame in talking about sexual fantasies and desires that might be considered taboo, because, by virtue of being LGBTQ, you've already transgressed some social boundaries. And so that makes it less costly in some ways to transgress other sexual boundaries, right? So I think that kind of opens the door to embrace other aspects of your sexual self and communicate about them with your partner.
That makes so much sense. And I'm always saying, I wish that heterosexual people would talk about sex earlier on, like right away. I mean, there's so much more to gain. But when it's like silent, we pretend it's not even really a thing. And because there is shame in talking about it. And I don't want this person to think something about me, whatever it is our beliefs are. It just could get it out of the way early on. I mean, just know. But I think a lot of people I just know that they don't really know what they want or they haven't experimented much. But would that ever happen, you think, on Grindr? Or is it pretty much like, you better be able to answer these questions? Because I feel like heterosexual couples are like, well, I'm not sure what I'm into or I haven't experimented enough.
Well, and I'm not going to paint anybody in broad strokes because there are some cis het people who are great at communicating about sex, and then
Yes,
there are
thank
some
you.
LGBTQ people who have a lot of sexual hangups and who are not very good at talking about it or just aren't comfortable doing it. So, we're talking about differences on average. There's always some variability, but I think the point is just within the LGBTQ community, you tend to see a bit more of this communication. People are more explicit about what they want. And so I think, there's actually a lot of things that we can learn from the LGBTQ community that could make heterosexual sexual dynamics better. And, another lesson that they can learn, for example, is to look at how lesbians define sex, right? So if you look at how heterosexuals define sex, the vast majority say penile vaginal intercourse. A high percentage will say penile anal intercourse, but most of them don't count oral sex and they don't count other activities. But if you look at lesbians, in the research I've seen, they count at least 10 different activities as sex. A majority of them do. And that includes just genital touching, where there isn't any penetration. It can include use of sex toys, right? So when you take this more expansive view of sex, it gives you more opportunities to be intimate when maybe you're in the mood for one thing, but your partner isn't. Well, you can explore other possibilities together.
Yeah.
And also, as you age and as your body changes, like if you have that expansive view of sex, it just gives you so many more possibilities for things you can do. So, I think there's lots of lessons that we can learn from other communities, apply in our own life, and enhance our sex lives.
Exactly, Justin. Absolutely. I love that you're bringing this up because I often say we're so in heterosexual relationships, we're so centered on penetration. And that's just not how a lot of vulva owners are going to say when they think about sex. That's not what they're looking for. They might not be in the mood. They don't have as much pleasure that way. Like to me, a great oral sesh, that is sex. So you're right. We're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. Thank you for supporting them. When we come back, I asked Justin about the difference between heterosexual and homosexual men's sex lives. Hint, they're not all that different. Be right back. We all want to feel healthy and energetic, but let's be honest, most of us are running on fumes. We're all doing our best to exercise and eat right, but with work and family and having a social life, it can be hard to prioritize self-care, believe me. But let me tell you firsthand, it doesn't have to be hard. That's why I take Field of Greens. It's whole organic fruits and vegetables, no extracts, no lab-made stuff. Just one scoop a day gives you simple, real nutrition. Field of Greens feeds your body with fruits and vegetables, medically chosen to support your heart, viral organs, and immune system. I love fruits and vegetables, but I'm going to be honest, I don't always have the time to cook or prepare a salad or chop up vegetables. More often than I'd like to admit, my fresh produce has already wilted by the time I get around to prepare it. I know I'm not alone with that one. This is why Field of Greens was the perfect fix for me, and I actually feel a difference. From running around all day, I've become used to hitting a midday slump, but I always have Field of Greens on me. I've had consistent energy throughout my workday, and then I'm able to get a solid sleep in the evenings as well. Field of Greens is my go-to for getting the nutrients I need for energy to get me through my day-to-day. You're going to love Field of Greens, but if you don't, you can return it for a full refund. I got 15% off your first order and free rush shipping. Visit fieldofgreens.com and use promo code SWE. That's promo code SWE at fieldofgreens.com. Fieldofgreens.com code SWE for 15% off. First of all, we're going to put all of your links in the show notes. But I love that your studies they're so well written, they're so easy to digest, and they're so fascinating. You also did an article of how similar or different are the sex lives of gay and straight men. If you want to talk about some of those findings.
So I love blogging about and podcasting about sex and taking the research and translating it for the public because there's so much great sex science that's out there, but it's written in this very jargon-filled way that, the average person just can't understand. So that's what I consider to be one of my jobs, is to take the research and make it digestible for you. And, you can learn things about yourself and about others, and hopefully that can help to improve and enhance your sex life. But for the specific article you mentioned, that was a write-up of a study comparing heterosexually identified and gay identified men in terms of, number of partners and how their sex lives are similar or different. And, it's interesting because people tend to think that gay and straight men are totally different, like that they're polar opposites. But what the data show is that they actually have a lot in common, especially in terms of their level of desire for sex. There is a difference in average number of partners, with gay men tending to have more, but that's likely because they have more sexual opportunities, because men on average are more interested in casual sex. It's not to say that women aren't interested in casual sex. They're just interested in casual sex that often happens under the terms that it's not offered, right? So, for example, if you look at some of the research where if women know that they're going to be with a highly skilled partner who's going to bring them a lot of pleasure that they really want to be with, their interest in casual sex is the same as men, right? So when you add pleasure to the equation, women are into it. But that it's not always there, right? And I know you've talked about this before a lot on your podcast and in your other work about women's pleasure just often isn't prioritized to the same degree as men's is. And that leads a lot of women to have unsatisfying casual sex experiences. So if we want to make casual sex better for women, we have to prioritize women's pleasure.
Cannot say it enough. There's a gap there. For a man, it can take about 8 to 10 minutes to orgasm, and for a woman, it can take between 20 and 40 minutes. I gotta say, I think you can speed this up a bit. Lalo, love Lalo, they have this toy that is all about G-spot stimulation. The Lalo Enigma Cruise is all about a blended G-spot and a clitoral orgasm. So the cruise uses these sonic waves and transmits them to your clitoris for deeper but gentler sensations, while the inner part in sync stimulates your G-spot. If you want to close your eyes for a minute and picture that, it's pretty hot. It's like having a threesome, but with one toy. It's pretty awesome. It's like if you want to explore the deeper sensations, definitely recommend this to get you there. And the Enigma Cruise has like 8 different vibration patterns. It has all these intensities. So just go check it out. If you're into squirting or you're into feeling good, go to lelo.com, that's lelo.com, and use my code SEXWITHEMILY for 25% off. Lelo.com, code SEXWITHEMILY for 25% off. And a lot of women email in and they're like, I really want to be able to have casual sex, but I don't, or I have weird, I don't feel great about it. It's like, well, then don't do it. There should be no pressure. And at the end of the day, and Justin's here to back me up, it's not as satisfying for women. Research even shows that. Having a highly skilled partner, God, could we vet for that? How do we find those people?
Another study I'm thinking about comparing gay and straight men looks at the kinds of porn that they watch and consume. And, a lot of people would kind of think that, well, you tend to watch porn that's consistent with your sexual identity. But what we see in the research, regardless of sexual orientation, is that there's a lot of identity discrepant porn watching that goes on. A lot of heterosexually identified men watch gay male porn, and a lot of gay identified men watch heterosexual porn, right? And I think that speaks to the fact that there's a lot of sexual fluidity across genders, across sexual orientations. And so we don't fit as neatly into these little boxes that people think that we do in terms of our sexual attractions and behaviors. And it's something that a lot of people just don't talk about. But that's one of the interesting things as a researcher, is that I ask people the questions that they're not typically asked by others. And we learn a lot about their sexuality. And it's far more diverse and variable than people give it credit for, and often doesn't match up with the stereotypes that people hold.
Yes, exactly. I always mention the Kinsey Scale, right?
Yep.
How it's a spectrum, and a lot of our listeners haven't really heard about it. Like, how many of us are fully heterosexual versus somewhere in the middle? So can you kind of talk about it for a minute? Because we do get a lot of questions from listeners, and if you're, maybe you've sent this question, if you're listening, women are like, I'm concerned, I'm watching lesbian porn, but I'm not a lesbian, or a lot of straight men say, I'm watching gay porn. What does it mean? So we get that all the time. And I'm always like, well, it's a spectrum, but maybe you could talk about it from actually being a Kinsey fellow.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of interesting work looking at the type of porn that women watch. And you have a lot of women, heterosexually identified women in particular, who watch gay male porn. And it's interesting when you look at their reasons for why they're watching it. For some, it's just, it's a novelty, or they're just like really into men. So having multiple men is like twice the the pleasure that they get out of it. And in other cases, you have women saying that they prefer to watch porn that doesn't have women in it, because then they're not psychologically putting themselves in the position of the women in the porn that they're consuming. And so it can allow them to be more in the moment and to enjoy what they're watching. And so when you're talking about something like porn watching, what do people watch and why? It's much more complex than people think it is, because human sexuality is inherently complex. And now I've gotten off on a porn tangent and I don't remember your
No, but
question.
that's true. That's so helpful, though. It's true. It doesn't have to mean anything, just that it's inherently complex, which I hadn't thought about that. Women just don't want to take other women out there. I don't want to be comparing my body to her body or her orgasms
Yep.
to mine. That makes so much sense.
Yeah. And has she consented to this? Like that's a whole other issue because you don't often see that consent negotiation piece in porn. And I think it's so
Exactly.
interesting when you see pornography where you have like an exit interview with the performers afterwards where
Right.
they talk about what that experience was like for them, and it's so fascinating. And I think when you have that present, I think it can provide a lot of reassurance to the viewer that, hey, everyone here was into it and on board, and here's what they took out of it and how they felt about it. And so having that sort of behind the scenes look, like lifting the veil behind pornography, is just a fascinating experience that I don't think most people have had, because what happens on set is very different from the shortened version that you see on your screen. There's so much happening behind the scenes. I was on a podcast with Tina Horn a couple of years ago, and I think she made the perfect analogy for this. She said, watching porn is like watching a cooking show, right? You're only seeing like the little highlights here and there, and you're not seeing like how long the whole process takes and everything that goes on behind the scenes. You're not seeing like the reapplications of lubrication and the consent negotiation beforehand. And so it's like you're watching the highlight reel as opposed to this whole experience and how it actually played out. And you also don't see things like the laughter that takes place between takes and like the communication and dynamic that can exist between the performers. And I think if you had a little bit more of that present, porn would feel a lot more ethical to some people.
Yeah, that's such a good analogy. I'm thinking about the cooking shows. Like somebody had to cut up those green beans. They're not already
Yep.
are like sliced and diced in the bowl. The equivalent of that would be like lube and warm up and consent. Like someone had to cut things up and make it all look pretty. That is a great analogy. But can we go back to the Kinsey scale for a
Yep.
second? Just kind of explaining the basic premise of that. When it first came out, like in the early 50s, right?
Yeah. So Alfred Kinsey did his pioneering research on human sexuality in the 40s and 50s, and he developed his famous Kinsey scale where he plotted sexual orientation or sexuality on a spectrum. And Kinsey wasn't really focused on sexual identity at the time because, people didn't really have the identity labels that we have today. And so his work was really focused more around sexual attraction and sexual behavior. And so he created this 0 to 6 scale, with 0 being exclusively heterosexual in terms of your attraction and behavior, and 6 being exclusively homosexual in terms of your attraction and behavior, with everything in the middle being some degree of bisexuality, with a 3 being equal attraction to men and to women. And then there was also an X on his scale for people who didn't really experience sexual attraction. So he did observe asexuality in a way and kind of allowed for that in his scale. So that was kind of like where the origins of this idea of sexuality on a spectrum began. I think the Kinsey scale made a really important contribution, but it's not necessarily optimal for how we assess sexual orientation, sexuality in the modern world, because we recognize it's really complex. There's so many components, and how do gender diverse individuals fit into this, right?
Right.
And also your sexual attraction versus your romantic attraction, and the number of partners that you want to have, and are you monogamously oriented or non-monogamously oriented? So when I have some colleagues who are trying to put all of these pieces together to sort of come up with kind of the grand theory of sexuality.
Oh, I would love that. So what could we do better in understanding people who are more fluid sexually? And if I recall correctly, that many people are a 0. Wasn't it more like people are more like a 1 or 2, right? Was that sort of what he found?
It also varied across men and across women in terms of kind of what the numbers were. I believe that Kinsey found that about 10% of the men he surveyed were a 5 or a 6. So they were at the more exclusively gay end of the spectrum, if you will. And so that's where this idea of 10% of the population being gay came from, is that Kinsey found that 10% of the men were a 5 or a 6. Now, the issue with drawing broad conclusions, sweeping conclusions from that, was that Kinsey didn't have a representative sample, right? He was studying sex in a time where it was really taboo. And so it was just whoever he could get to talk to him. And so he did oversample from the gay community. He did a lot of his work interviewing men in gay bars. And so you can't necessarily look at, his findings and say, these are direct population estimates. And actually, it wasn't until the 1990s that we actually had our first nationally representative survey of human sexuality in the United States, right?
Really?
when you think about it from that standpoint, our knowledge of human sexuality is still really young. It's still in its infancy in a lot of ways because there's so many barriers to studying it.
God, that's amazing. Then maybe it was the women were a little bit more one or two, right?
Yeah. So in the modern research, we see that there is more variability in, sort of where women fall on these scales compared to men, whereas men tend to cluster more at the far ends of the spectrum. You have more women, kind of in the middle. And we see this across a wide range of studies, but there's also, some age-related differences in this as well. So if you look at the oldest Americans today, you have a very small percentage who identify as LGBTQ. It's about 1% to 2%. But if you look at the youngest Americans today, the 18 to 24-year-olds, according to recent national polls, about 16% of them identify as LGBTQ, which is a huge number.
I saw
right?
that. I think it was a 40% increase, it said, in people who had identified as LGBTQ. I thought that was amazing.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when you look at where the growth is. So actually the number of Americans who identify as gay or lesbian actually hasn't really changed over the years in recent decades. It's the number who identify as bisexual or as trans or non-binary where you're really seeing that high level of growth. And I think, for the bisexual identification piece, bisexuality has long been really stigmatized. And despite the fact that Americans are much more accepting of gays and lesbians today, they're not necessarily that much more accepting of bisexuals, right? And I've written about this on the blog where attitudes toward gays and lesbians have moved on average positive over time, whereas attitudes toward bisexuals have only become neutral, right? People still have a lot of hangups about bisexuality.
What do you think that's about, all the hangups? I get a lot of questions about that too. We don't have a lot of examples of it.
There's a lot of questioning of whether it's real. And that's especially true for men who identify as bisexual. People are more accepting of women's bisexuality, especially if you look at, say, heterosexual men, because they eroticize, women who are into same-sex experiences. But you don't necessarily see that same level of eroticization of bisexual men among heterosexual women, right? And I hear this from a lot of bisexual men where they actually find it really hard to find female partners because there are a lot of women who are convinced that they're secretly gay and that they could never be happy in a relationship with them and that they would always want to leave them for a man. And so, there's all these stereotypes about bisexuals that they can't be monogamous, that they're secretly gay. And it's really, really harmful. And so that has led a lot of people to hide their bisexuality from their partners. But what we're seeing, especially among younger adults, is that they're getting a lot more comfortable acknowledging and coming out with their bisexual identities.
I think that's exciting. I cheered when I read that. It's so exciting. So let's talk about dating for a minute. What about friends with benefits? Because we do get a lot of questions about this, and I know you've done some work around this. What happens with friends with benefits? How do they work out? Who experiences better versus worse outcomes?
So I love this topic. What I learned from a decade of research on friends with benefits.
Okay, this is so good. Everyone, check it out. Check out his site, lehmiller.com, but he's going to give us the highlights right now.
So, actually my very first sex study, like how I dipped my toes in the water, was by studying friends with benefits. And it was because I had a lot of my college students who were asking me, how do these relationships work? What do I need to know? And I was like, well, I'd love to give you an answer, but I don't have data to give you an answer that's, to base it on. And I always want to, when I'm talking about and answering people's questions, to have some data to back it up. Otherwise, I'll just, say, I don't know, I got to go conduct the study first and so come back. But one of the studies that I did with some of my colleagues was a 1-year longitudinal study of friends with benefits. So we followed people for a year to see what happens to their friends with benefits relationship over time. And to my knowledge, it's the first longitudinal study of this. And it was really fascinating because we saw that these relationships go off in a lot of different directions. And most of them did not last, for that entire full year period. You had some who went on to become romantic partners, some who were still friends with benefits, some who went back to being just friends, and then some who became frenemies, right? So they kind of lost their entire connection. And it was really split across the board in terms of those outcomes. So there wasn't really just one trajectory that these relationships took. They went off a lot of different ways. But one of the key things we saw in that research was that for the people who managed after that year to still be on good terms with their friends with benefit, they had the communication in the beginning. They set the ground rules. They got on the same page about what their expectations were. What is this and what isn't this, right? And that's where a lot of friends with benefits go wrong, is that people come in with different expectations. One person sees this as a chance to be with this person and maybe turn it into a romantic relationship. The other person is really just looking for no string sex. And so that's where things tend to go wrong.
That's so true. We got to get so if you want to have a better threesome and a better friends with benefit situation, communicate, everyone. Or really, I mean, let's just be honest. Every sexual situation will benefit from some healthy communication. And how common are these friends with benefits relationships?
They are common, and they're actually becoming increasingly common. So if you look at nationally representative surveys over time, when people are asked, have you ever had sex with a friend before? You've seen this increase in recent years. So friends with benefits are on the rise. They're becoming more common. And I want to say, to the best of my recollection, because this wasn't one of my studies and it's been a little while since I wrote about it, but it was between 40 and 50% of Americans today who said that they had had sex with a friend before, right? Which says this is not at all an uncommon experience. And that's another one of those things that increased to some degree during the pandemic, right? Because a lot of people lived with a friend or a roommate and they couldn't go out and date and hook up and do these other things. And so there were a lot of friends and roommates who hooked up during the pandemic.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
What else are you going to do? Yeah. And I do feel like I'm hearing more about them, but often with that confusing, like, what's your intentions? Is that really what you want? So that's really important to talk about it. Because in the end, you do see some cases where it works out. An article you did was about another study, and I was so excited about this. 4 ways men say couples' vibrators improved their sex lives. And I was like, is this a gift that just came up the day before he's on the show? What did that study find?
So this was an interesting study where they gave heterosexual men who volunteered for the study a free couples vibrator and gave them instructions in how to use it. They didn't want them flying blind here. And they gave them about 2 months and said, we want you to have sex with the vibrator a certain number of times and then have sex without the vibrator a certain number of times. And then they gave them several surveys so they could compare their sexual experiences. And one of the things they found was that the vast majority of men, 71%, said that using the couple's vibrator enhanced their sexual pleasure, and 88% said that they plan to keep using the vibrator even after the study was over. And when you looked at, what specifically men were saying about how did this vibrator improve their sex life with their partner, one of them was that it enhanced pleasure for them and their partner. And one of the ways that it enhanced pleasure is that by using this couple's vibrator, their hands were free to do other things and pursue other forms of stimulation. So I think, it can make it a more multi-sensory experience in some ways. And then there was also the appreciation of their partner's pleasure. So the men saw how this enhanced their partner's pleasure, and that turned them on even more, right? And seeing your partner pleased and satisfied is really hot, right? So this is an easy way that you can sort of boost your partner's pleasure and your own pleasure at the same time. And then there's just the novelty aspect, trying something new, getting some different sensation. And then the intimacy aspect. You had a lot of men who said they felt more connected to their partner, in part because they often had simultaneous orgasms, right? So, there's all kinds of ways that exploring sex toys and couples vibrators like this can improve your sex life.
I found that too, anecdotally, in my life and friends' lives, that once they get past that whole stigma, vibrator is going to replace me, which people still believe this, that this study was so great to see. No, you're actually, just try it a few times. And they had to here for a study. But I love that they came to the conclusion that I would assume that, and what I've seen, again, anecdotally, that people, they love the toys. They're like, get out that toy. You're going to bring the toy. And then they forget they ever had the worries about it. I wonder which couple's toy they used. Do you know? Did they all get the same one?
It was a WeVibe.
A WeVibe. I figured.
Yes, I forget exactly which model it was,
probably.
but yeah.
Yeah, the WeVibe Sync is a great couple's toy. This is great. I was so happy to read that. When people ask me, what should we do about sex ed? I always say, well, the only place that I see it doing well is in the Netherlands. So what can we learn from the Dutch? How do we improve sex ed?
Great question. So I've actually taught several study abroad courses in Amsterdam. In the past, they've all been taking groups of college students to the Netherlands to learn about sex and culture. And those were probably the most rewarding experiences of my entire teaching career, because I was taking college students from Indiana to another country. For some of them, it was their first time out of the US. For some, it was their first time on an airplane. And so you got to share that really eye-opening experience with them. And then they, wind up in the red light district. And it's just, it's fascinating.
But that's not the whole trip. That was after class. Okay. Right.
Well, we did our tours of the red light district, right? So we actually had sex workers who would walk us around the red light district and explain to us how all of this works. And it was so fascinating to be there to watch the sale of sex happen out in the open, right? Where the communication, the negotiation happens like right there at a window, and then people agree to it, they go in, right? And so there's not that sort of shame and stigma of sex work where in countries where it's illegal, where it's all underground. And so just being able to see that negotiation out in the open is fascinating in and of itself. In the US, we tend to focus only on the really negative side of sex, and it's just stay away from it. Over there, certainly they talk about STIs and STDs, but they also teach you sexual communication skills. And they start at a very early age in kindergarten, teaching you about boundaries and how to communicate about them. They actually teach you the proper anatomical names for your body. They mention the word clitoris. Like, how fucking great is that, right?
Right, at 5, right. There's my clitoris. It's amazing.
So they know their bodies. They know how to communicate boundaries and respect for others. And they also teach them how to navigate difficult sexual situations. So for example, there's this workbook that they give to all the students that I just adore, because they give them these difficult sexual situations. You got these boxes with bubbles of people talking. And, one of the situations is one partner wants to use a condom, but the other one doesn't. And so how do you resolve that discrepancy? That's an issue that often comes up. And most of us have no template for how do we do that? What do we do in that situation? So they actually try to help people to build the sexual communication skills that are going to serve them well. And the result of it is that in the Netherlands, they have the lowest rates of teen pregnancy, teen STIs, and teen abortion in the industrialized world. And here in the US, we have the highest rates of all of those things.
Let's just let that sink in for a moment, people. Really. I mean, think about what we could learn from that. It's just because we just don't require sex ed. And when we do, it's not accurate. I mean, what could parents do? Maybe we're not going to get it in schools, but what could parents do now? Because people always say, how do I answer the questions?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things that you can do as a parent. One is to start at a young age, right? Talking to your kids about sex. And that's not to say at a young age, you're teaching them about intercourse and how it works. Rather, teach them the correct names for their body parts rather than euphemisms. And also teach them things about, how do you say if somebody touches you and you don't want to be touched, how do you communicate about that? It doesn't necessarily have to be sexual touch. You're just building that broader communication skill, right? Because that's something that is going to serve your child well throughout their entire life, right? And if something were to happen to them, they'd be more likely to communicate it to you, right? So this is good for everyone, for your kids to be equipped with these skills. Another thing is, if your kids ask questions about sex, be honest with them. Don't make up stories, don't treat it like Santa Claus, where you're just going to make up some myth or something like that and talk about the stork and so forth. You don't have to get into the mechanics of sex and all this stuff at a young age. Think about this as it's age appropriate, developmentally appropriate. Give them the information that they need. Don't be afraid to, answer questions if your kids have curiosity, because if they don't get the answer from you, they're probably going to go look for it somewhere else. And they might not get as good of an answer if they do. And then something else is figure out when your kids are learning about sex in school, what are they learning, so that you can fill in the gaps, because odds are your school isn't going to teach the kids everything they need to know. And also, you can't cover everything they need to know in the span of one talk, right? So instead of thinking about the talk, think about having a series of talks with your child over time where you tell them what they need to know at that particular point in time. And that means, at some point it's going to be talking about sex and how it works, talking about your body, talking about safe sex and protection, talking about how relationships work, right? We need relationship education too. So think about how you're going to cover these things, and you don't have to do it all at once. And the earlier you start kind of normalizing this, the less awkward it's going to be. Where people run into problems is they just wait and wait and wait. And then it's too late. Their kids are already having sex and they've missed out on that opportunity to increase the odds that they had a safe, pleasurable, positive experience.
Exactly. It's so true. We're going to miss out. I think people assume like, oh, they're teaching sex. No, they're not teaching penetration when the kids are 5. You know,
No.
it's age appropriate. What about masturbation? Because I have a lot of people and listeners, kids who are starting to masturbate, and that's something that I'm like, well, talk to them about it, and they're just like, ugh. Because here we have parents who weren't educated either, and they still have shame around it. So how do we stop? Or what do they do in the Netherlands? How do they talk to their kids about masturbation? How can we help people here?
I mean, masturbation, we have to recognize it's a normal, healthy part of sexual expression. There's nothing wrong with it. And actually, masturbation is good for us. Masturbation is a form of self care. Masturbation has a lot of benefits. And so, there are obviously certain lessons that, you would want to teach your kids about. That's something you do in private. A lot of kids will touch themselves and they kind of have to learn, like, no, that's not something you do at the dinner table and so forth. So, you got to teach them the appropriate boundaries, but don't shame them and tell them to not do it. It's really the shame piece that is so damaging around both sex and masturbation. And when you start saying that's dirty, that is shameful, that's disgusting, you should never do that, that's where you're starting to set your kid down the path of having a lot of conflicts around sex, and can make it harder for them to communicate about sex with their partners and to get what they want and to build healthy, satisfying relationships. So I think, sort of the biggest lesson we can learn is to avoid the shaming piece of it and to have the open communication, if your child has questions about it. And, different parents are going to have different levels of comfort with this. I totally get that. And that's okay. Just try to avoid the shame piece.
By shame piece, we mean your kid's touching yourself and you say, no, that's wrong. That's dirty. If they're like 2 years old and their hands on their pants, like that's when it starts.
And then we call it their private parts oftentimes too, which, sort of adds this other level to it. Like it's like something that never should be shown to anyone, let alone a partner and so forth. So
exactly.
It's just thinking about what's the language that you're using, what are the lessons that you want to convey to them, and if it's one that sex and masturbation are unhealthy, shameful, bad things, that can actually be very psychologically damaging to people and can be really hard to get over. I had Kristen Mark on my podcast, who has done some work on, sort of the early lessons that people have gotten about sex and how they carry them with them for a lifetime. And it can be really psychologically devastating. So I think it's important to reframe the messages that we're providing to our kids around sex and masturbation.
Yeah. They really do. They really do carry me. Just people think, oh, well, it was when I was younger. But yeah, if you were, practicing a certain religion until you were 18 and you heard every day, like, don't have sex or it's wrong or it's make you blind or whatever, it doesn't mean that you just all of a sudden start having sex and you don't still have that wiring, that conditioning.
It's traumatic. It's another way to think about it is that, especially if you tell your kids that all of these bad, terrible things are going to happen to them if they masturbate or if they have sex, that creates a lot of anxiety around this that can be hard to move past.
Exactly, Justin. This is so good, the work you're doing. Is there anything that you recommend to parents right now? Like, is there a great book for talking to your kids about sex? Is there something that you recommend?
I mean, there are lots of great books around this, and it kind of depends on where your child is in their developmental process. For example, if you have a teenager, there's this great book called SEX. It's sort of the comprehensive guide to everything you need to know to get you through your teens and 20s. That can be a great gift to give your kid, especially if you're not super knowledgeable about sex yourself or you're really uncomfortable with it. At least you can give them this tool that can equip them with the knowledge so that they're not instead turning to porn or to their peers who may know even less than they do, and they're getting incorrect information. Some of the other books I would recommend, especially if your child is young and you're getting ready to kind of have that series of talks, there's a book called Read Me by Lene St. John, which is sort of this parental primer for how you have these talks. If your child is really young and you want to teach them about sort of boundaries and consent, there's a book called Let's Talk About Body Boundaries, Consent and Respect. And it's great for kind of giving you the tools and the language you need to help your child at the age where they are and help them learn what it is that they need to know. So many great resources out there. Just go out and look for them, and don't be afraid to start that series of talks.
Exactly. Just talk about it. And Lene St. John's, actually, we went to grad school together. We did an episode maybe about a year or two ago. So you guys can check out that episode as well. Justin, this is so helpful. You are doing incredible work, and I'm so happy to see you again. I want to ask you the quickie questions we ask all of our guests. There's 5 of them. Ready?
Okay.
What is your biggest turn on?
What comes to mind first is actually partner pleasure. Like it's like knowing that the other person is really into it, because that means they're really into you and you're doing something right. And,
Exactly.
it feels good. It's really hot to know that everybody's there. And I think, that's where we need to rethink these conversations around consent. Like consent is really hot, right? And desire, mutual desire, really hot too. So it's all about partner pleasure.
I love it. What's your biggest turnoff?
Ooh, that's kind of like changed over time. Because I used to be somebody who was like, sex can only happen in a sensory deprivation chamber when the lights are off and there's no sound or anything else, because I was like very easily distracted.
Right.
But I don't have as many of those anymore. I'm trying to think,
good.
is there like
We
one
work through
specific thing? I don't know. But it would be a different answer depending on where I am in my life.
Okay, got it. What makes good sex?
Of course, the communication always makes it good, because you have to be able to tell your partner what it is that you want. So I think that's really the key, is being able to say what you want and to listen to what your partner is saying about what they want, and to work your best to make sure that everybody is getting a little bit of that, or a lot of it.
Something you tell your younger self about sex and relationships.
It's not dirty and shameful. And that's, relationships are great, but they're hard work. And, that there isn't like just that one ideal person out there that you're going to meet and everything's going to work out perfectly. It's, the way to think about a soulmate is it's that person who makes you want to work on the relationship, and that person who motivates you to get up and do that. And so that's, I think, a really important lesson for relationships.
Good. Number one thing you wish everyone knew about sex?
Well, I think the number one thing I would say would be that sex isn't just one thing. Sex can be anything you want it to be. And the narrower your definition of sex, the more likely you are to be setting yourself up for disappointment and for disagreement and conflict in your relationship. So I think it's really important to expand that definition, have this whole erotic buffet of things that you can choose from. And so then, you can always figure out something to connect and to get pleasure and have intimacy.
So well said. So inspiring. Justin, where can everyone find you?
Well, my podcast and blog are Sex and Psychology. You can find it at lehmiller.com or sexandpsychology.com. You can also find links to my books and other projects. And you can follow me on the social medias. I'm on Twitter at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller.
Thank you so much for being here, Justin. I so appreciate you. And we have to do this more often and then meet in person.
Yes, always great to see you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. That's it for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Sex with Emily, and be sure to like, subscribe, and give us a review wherever you listen to the podcast, and share this with a friend or partner. You can find me on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, or X, and Facebook. It's all at Sex with Emily. Oh, and I've been told I give really good email, so sign up on sexwithemily.com, and while you're there, check out my free guides and articles for more ways to prioritize your pleasure. And if you'd like to ask me about your sex life, dating, or relationships, call my hotline, 559-TALK-SEX. That's 559-825-5739, or just go to sexwithemily.com/askemily. Was it good for you? Email me, feedback@sexwithemily.com.